Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg.
A difficult situation in China, the economy. I still think actually for next year, the focus is going to be on the 5-year plan.
The growth is still very, very unbalanced. A year later, we're still now debating whether you're going to need another policy support going into September Politburo meeting.
Demand side is not doing very well, not for the first month. This is already the fourth month we're talking about.
They are actually quite happy with how their economy performed in the first half of last year, but they know that the consumer stimulus that they employed can't be effective forever.
Washington is dealing with a much more assertive Beijing.
We think it's the defining conflict of this generation.
The Chinese economy is facing a host of challenges, and Beijing has a plan, or at least it will. The country's next 5-year plan will chart a path for China's economic and social development from 2026 to 2030, and it's a strategy that has global consequences. Here's why China's next 5-year plan matters for the world. Jenni Marsh, who leads Bloomberg's team covering China's economy and government, joins me now for more. Jenni, this plan is going to be finalised at an upcoming meeting of policymakers, the so-called fourth plenum. What's the economic context that they'll have in mind?
Well, since China made its last 5-year plan, a lot has happened. Obviously, we've had the pandemic, which just sort of upended global supply chains. And ever since then, the Chinese economy has really just been on shaky ground. There's a property crisis now, which is grinding on. It's been years. China's battling entrenched deflation, looking at its third year of falling prices across the economy this year. Its companies are sort of locked in these price wars, which is hurting their bottom lines and affecting job growth. And of course, now they're in a trade war as well. So the one thing that's going right for the Chinese economy, which is exports, are under a lot of pressure now politically from the US, but also other countries. So they go into this meeting with a lot of problems to solve.
So just remind us, what sort of policies have gone into previous 5-year plans?
So China adopted this model from the Soviet Union, and ever since then, they have to sort of emulate that system every 5 years. And in the beginning, it was sort of very detailed, specific targets. But since the beginning of this century, rather than setting such detailed targets, they've shifted into this mode of focusing on broader tasks and objectives. The last 5-year plan was significant because they moved away from setting a specific growth target, which they used to do. And now it's much more about being broader around the growth target and sort of saying that, they're looking for a high growth environment or that kind of thing. But we're not going to get a specific number in the way that we used to. But for example, in the last 5-year plan, they set this long-term target of basically achieving socialist modernization by 2035. So that's quite vague, typically like Communist Party sort of term, but it translates to things like significant gains in GDP, technological innovation, increases in per capita income, and the size of the middle income group in China. These are the sorts of things we've seen in the past.
How does this plan get drawn up? What's the process?
It is a months-long process, and the contributors even include Xi Jinping himself, who back in April convened a seminar in Shanghai with provincial governors, where he gets input, according to state media at least. The central government invites the public to submit suggestions through a website, and then top policymakers in the Politburo huddle behind closed doors. We've seen hints from the Politburo. The meetings, they've talked about developing new productive forces, tech innovation, scientific expansion. But by the time I get to this plenum, everything is decided. And so it's a 4-day meeting where they're going to sort of talk about things. But really, by the time they get there, it's all written down and they're kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
So what do we know then about what might be in this upcoming plan?
We do know that the government is considering a new version of Xi's Made in 25 campaign, and that focused on making China a leader in high-tech goods. So we had a scoop about that back in May, and that's one of the key things we'll be looking out for. Made in 2025 is this sort of idea of Made in China is bringing high-tech sort of goods to Chinese production, moving up the value chain. And so this is central to China's ambition to take on the US. in areas from chip design all the way through to aviation. We will look out for the language around growth. They're going to have to address the fallout from the property market collapse, which has been now dragging on since 2021. There's rising youth unemployment. There could be policies to target that. And we think as well, inclusive growth is going to be a big thing for social stability. So that's expanding the social welfare net. So policies indicating they're going to do more for pension provision, for people with families. At that symposium in April that she hosted, they did say that this plan should stabilize employment, the business environment, and market expectations. So these are sort of some of the breadcrumbs that we have so far.
Should we expect to hear more about China's trade policies given the ongoing tensions with the US?
I think that yes, but indirectly. This kind of a broad policy document probably won't mention the US by name. It won't address such current issues. But of course, it will lay out priorities in the industrial sector, and it will talk about how China wants to shape its economy in the next 5 years. We expect there's going to be a shift to domestic services, prioritizing those. When it comes to consumption, China's goods consumption is actually very strong, on par with other developed countries in the US economy. But when it comes to service consumption, that's quite weak. And so that matters for the US because they really want China to try to rebalance their economy, to be less reliant on exporting and more dependent on the domestic consumer. The policies in this document are going to be very much of interest to the US and have ramifications for China's global trade relationship.
What else should we look out for in terms of what's in this plan that might affect countries elsewhere in the world?
I think it's really going to be about, I suppose, the tone that China takes to the rest of the world. Are they talking about sort of embracing the systems that we already have in terms of the UN and the WTO? More signs that China wants to maintain the status quo. And then I really think it's this idea of rebalancing. Scott Bessent has already specifically said he is looking to the 5-year plan, and he has asked Chinese officials to write this plan with a view to rebalance the Chinese economy away from flooding global markets. And that's a concern not just for the US, but for Europe. Even friendly countries in Latin America, such as Brazil, have been raising concerns about this. So I think a lot of people are going to want to see efforts to get the Chinese consumer spending. China has 1.4 billion people. Why does it need to rely on the rest of the world to buy its products? I think that probably is the thing from an international perspective that foreign governments will be really looking towards.
OK, we'll be watching out to see what indications we might get. Jenni Marsh, leading our team covering China's economy and government. Thank you. For more explanations like this from our team of 3,000 journalists and analysts around the world, go to bloomberg.com/explainers. I'm Stephen Carroll. This is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.